Good evening. This is your escape to alternate realities, mysteries of the unknown, or sometimes even your greatest fears. For centuries, tales of the riveting or enigmatic have been a transport for the mind to highs, lows, and all things in between. The destination for your consciousness awaits you at the door. We will begin shortly, so sit wherever you'd like, get comfortable, and welcome to the Fable Coalition. I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of better terms, an absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me, and there was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared back at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone could call the cops. I did manage to find home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or inside jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. The fury helped suppress the entity. I never taken part in alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than a minor alteration. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite TV show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly, Daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few mass questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and he was my son. The agony and heartbreak filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know his first years of his life. My wife and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost. I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priest didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on the scans or the tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell my wife. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But still, I had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life, and I wasn't actually home inside of my head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the door, but by knocking on it. I answered and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. This is a fancy dinner for a second date. I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I had gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as just dating jitters. I was just excited to see that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went on for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and new time in my life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said a writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then I was back in month 2 of my relationship, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, and I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-round, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. While we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed me like I had wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed the trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be jumped between times in my life, heartbeat to heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak to anyone else, never able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of fear came upon me, I sat an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought me was like a panacea on my mental wounds. And I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" Eh. He startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you like to read it and tell me what you think?" "All right, run off. I'll read this for now." The words were blurry and annoyed. I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. My wife puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I don't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on his way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story and called out to my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How was it?" "Sure, I read everything I can. I love it." Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone about my life and what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it well. "You're serious?" "Yeah." He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. "I'll look into it, see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map out your psychic wound." Wow, sounds like a plan. I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. But how will I get the notes in one place? "Let's come up with somewhere you can leave them," he said, frowning with thought. "Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life. See if there's a pattern." For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. "How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there." "Sure." He turned and left the living room. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. Did I write those? He looked up at me with wonder. Yeah, or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird. That much I understood. Right. There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time. His tone dropped to deadly seriousness. But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand over the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized into the room. Come on. I think I finally figured it out. I was so frail that moving was painful. Are you him? Are you my grandson? Yeah. He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this?" Fearful, I asked, "Is my wife here?" His face softened. No, not for a few years now. I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. How? We have this conversation a lot, he responded. Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better. Tears brimmed in my eyes. Then I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive. He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades figuring this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. The parasite doesn't technically exist on our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of this one being, and it feeds on the plexus of our mind, soul, and quantum consciousness, or reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head, an exact line where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. What's the being? He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite. But it's basically electroshock therapy. I could see my wife smile. Even though she was dead, I'd just been with her moments ago. Do it. A click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh no, it did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold my wife's hand and be there for her. No, no. That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she was laying on a hospital bed for a very different reason. No, not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down into tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't seen the worst part, the inevitable end that all would face one day. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout, and the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh, God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept toward like just before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze. And while I was sitting there, processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was just made up to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in the hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew.